The cruelest kind of invitation is the one disguised as kindness. The chandelier light spilled across the ballroom like liquid gold, reflecting off crystal glasses and polished marble floors. Soft jazz drifted through the air while servers moved between guests carrying silver trays filled with champagne. Everything about the evening looked elegant. Perfect. Carefully planned. And that was exactly the point. Claire Bennett paused just inside the entrance, her fingers resting lightly against the strap of her black evening dress. The room was already watching her. Not openly. Not yet. But she could feel it. The quick glances. The whispered comments. The subtle turns of heads. Some people looked surprised she had actually come. Others looked almost excited. They weren't here for the engagement party. They were here for the story. 3 years ago, Claire and Jason Carter had been the couple everyone admired. Tonight, they would become entertainment. At the center of the ballroom stood Jason himself, smiling beneath a canopy of white roses and golden lights. Beside him was Madison Reed, his fiancée. Her diamond ring flashed every time she lifted her hand, catching the attention she clearly enjoyed. Jason laughed at something a guest said, then his eyes drifted toward the entrance. Toward Claire. His smile widened. Not warmly. Not kindly. It was the smile of a man who believed he had one. Claire met his gaze from across the room. For a second, neither moved. Then Jason raised his champagne glass slightly, as if welcoming an old friend. The gesture looked polite. To everyone else, it probably seemed generous. Claire knew better. She had known Jason long enough to recognize performance when she saw it. He wasn't inviting her to celebrate. He had invited her to witness his victory. Around her, conversations softened. A woman near the bar leaned closer to her husband and whispered something. Two former friends exchanged knowing looks. Nobody expected drama. They expected humiliation. Claire slowly exhaled and stepped forward. The heels of her shoes clicked softly against the marble floor. One step. Then another. Calm. Measured. Unhurried. Jason watched her approach. Through the crowd. Madison followed his gaze and immediately understood who had arrived. Her expression brightened with curiosity. Claire noticed that too. She noticed everything. The expensive flowers. The custom decorations. The giant engagement photograph displayed near the stage. The smiling faces. The carefully arranged image of success. Jason reached her first. Claire, he said smoothly. I'm glad you came. The words sounded welcoming. The satisfaction behind them did not. Congratulations, Claire replied. Her voice was steady. Jason blinked almost imperceptibly. He had expected discomfort. Maybe sadness. Perhaps regret. Instead, she looked composed. As though she had simply arrived at another evening event. Madison stepped beside him and extended her hand. It's so nice to finally meet you. Claire accepted the handshake politely. The diamond on Madison's finger sparkled beneath the chandelier lights. Somewhere behind them, someone snapped a photograph. Another guest laughed too loudly. The night continued moving forward. Yet something invisible had shifted. Jason felt it without understanding why. Claire smiled. Not the smile of a woman trying to prove she was happy. Not the smile of someone seeking revenge. Just a quiet smile that reached her eyes for a brief moment before disappearing again. And for the first time that evening, Jason found himself wondering why she looked completely unafraid. Claire moved deeper into the ballroom while the music continued to drift beneath the glow of golden chandeliers. Around her, conversations resumed, but not completely. Every few seconds she caught fragments of whispers floating through the crowd like smoke. Some remembered her wedding. Some remembered her divorce. Most remembered the version of the story Jason had allowed everyone to hear. A server offered her a glass of sparkling water, and she accepted it with a quiet smile. The cold crystal rested lightly against her fingertips. Across the room, Madison stood surrounded by friends, displaying her engagement ring whenever someone asked to see it. Laughter followed her everywhere. Jason seemed equally comfortable, shaking hands, accepting congratulations. Enjoying the attention that came with being the center of the evening. To anyone watching, they looked like the perfect couple beginning a perfect future. Claire stood alone near one of the tall windows overlooking the city skyline. Beyond the glass, thousands of lights stretched into the darkness. The city looked calm from 40 stories above the streets. Distant traffic moved like ribbons of red and white beneath the night sky. For a brief moment, the noise inside the ballroom faded. She remembered another night years ago when she and Jason had stood together on a rooftop downtown. They had been younger then. Less polished. Less certain. He had wrapped an arm around her shoulders and pointed toward the skyline, promising that one day they would build a life they could both be proud of. Back then, she believed every word. The memory arrived quietly and left just as quietly. It no longer carried the weight it once had. Nearby, two women glanced toward her before quickly looking away. Claire caught the expression anyway. Sympathy. The kind people reserved for someone they assumed had lost. One of them finally approached. "It is good to see you," she said carefully. "You look well." Claire thanked her. The woman hesitated, searching for something else to say, then returned to her group. Claire understood. Most people did not know how to speak to someone they believed had been left behind. A large digital screen near the stage displayed photographs of Jason and Madison smiling on beaches, attending charity events, and posing beneath sunsets. Each image seemed designed to tell the same story. Success. Happiness. Victory. Claire studied the pictures for a moment before taking a small sip from her glass. Her expression never changed. Jason noticed. From across the ballroom, he watched her standing alone. He expected disappointment. Maybe even envy. Instead, she appeared strangely patient. As though she was not waiting for the evening to end. As though she was waiting for something else entirely. The realization unsettled him more than he cared to admit. He checked the entrance without thinking. Then he looked back at Claire. She glanced briefly toward the elevators. Near the far side of the room. Only for a second. Most people would not have noticed. Jason did. And for reasons he could not explain, that simple glance made him uneasy. Because for the first time all night, he began to suspect that Claire had not come here alone after all. The ballroom seemed warmer as the evening continued, though Claire suspected it was not the temperature that had changed. It was the attention. More people were noticing her now. Not because she demanded it. Not because she spoke loudly. The opposite, in fact. While everyone else chased the spotlight, Claire appeared untouched by it. That alone made people curious. Jason felt the shift as well. Standing near the stage, he accepted another round of congratulations, but his focus kept drifting back toward the woman by the window. 3 years ago, he would have known exactly what Claire was thinking. At least he believed he would have. Tonight she felt unfamiliar. The certainty that once defined him began to crack around the edges. Madison slipped her arm through his and smiled for a photograph. Camera flashes lit the room for a moment before fading. When the photographer moved on, Madison lowered her voice. She seemed surprisingly comfortable. Jason forced a small laugh. She is probably trying to save face. Madison nodded, but her eyes lingered on Claire a little longer than necessary. Something about the situation felt different than either of them expected. Near the center of the ballroom, a master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage and tapped a microphone. The soft conversations gradually quieted. Guests turned toward the front of the room. Crystal glasses settled onto tables. Chairs shifted. The evening was moving into its formal celebration. Jason walked onto the stage beside Madison, smiling beneath the golden lights. The giant screen behind them displayed another slideshow of carefully selected memories. Vacation photographs. Charity galas. Sunset dinners. Applause filled the room. Claire watched from a distance. She noticed how easily Jason commanded attention. He had always been talented at that. Even during their marriage, he could walk into a room and become its center within minutes. Back then she had admired it. Later she learned that some people become addicted to admiration. Jason raised his glass and began speaking. His voice carried smoothly across the ballroom. He thanked friends, family, colleagues, and everyone who had supported their journey. The audience laughed at the right moments. Smiled at the right moments. Everything unfolded exactly as planned. Then his eyes found Claire. Only briefly. But the pause was there. Life has a way of bringing the right people into your path, he said. Sometimes you have to let go of what no longer belongs in your future so that something better can arrive. A few guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. The message was subtle enough to deny, but clear enough to understand. Madison smiled beside him. Several people looked toward Claire, waiting for a reaction. They found none. Claire simply lifted her glass and took a small sip. Calm. Unbothered. The silence that followed felt strangely powerful. Jason continued speaking, yet something had shifted again. His words landed differently because she refused to carry the role he had written for her. Then, from somewhere beyond the ballroom doors, a soft chime echoed through the reception area. The elevators had reached the top floor. Several heads turned automatically. A hotel attendant stepped forward. The doors slowly opened. And for reasons he could not explain, Jason felt his stomach tighten before he even saw who had arrived. The elevator doors opened with a soft metallic whisper, and for a brief moment the ballroom seemed to hold its breath. Several guests glanced toward the entrance expecting another colleague, another friend, another late arrival to the celebration. Instead, a hotel attendant stepped aside respectfully as a tall man in a charcoal suit entered the room. Nothing about him appeared dramatic. No grand announcement followed. No entourage surrounded him. Yet something about the way he carried himself drew attention without asking for it. Claire recognized him immediately. A faint warmth touched her expression before she lowered her eyes toward the glass in her hand. Across the ballroom, Jason noticed that tiny change. It lasted less than a second, but it was enough. The stranger paused near the entrance, thanking the attendant with a polite nod before scanning the room. His gaze eventually settled on Claire. The corners of his mouth lifted into a calm smile. Not surprised. Not uncertain. As though he had known exactly where he would find her. Meanwhile, the celebration continued on stage. Applause followed the end of Jason's speech, but much of the room had become distracted. Human curiosity was difficult to control. Guests quietly wondered who the newcomer was and why Claire suddenly seemed less alone than she had only moments earlier. Madison noticed it too. "Do you know him?" she asked Jason quietly. Jason stared toward the entrance. "No," he answered. Yet something about the man bothered him. Not because he recognized him. Because he did not. Most people who moved within their social circles were familiar faces. This man was not. The stranger began walking through the ballroom. Servers instinctively moved aside. Conversations softened as he passed. He acknowledged a few guests with courteous smiles but never slowed his pace. His destination was obvious. Claire set her glass down on a nearby table. The city lights shimmered behind her through the enormous windows. As the distance between them closed, an unexpected memory surfaced. 3 years earlier, after the divorce papers had been finalized, Claire had returned to an apartment that suddenly felt too quiet. She remembered standing alone in a kitchen illuminated only by the glow of a refrigerator light. No celebration. No dramatic speeches. Just silence. The kind of silence that forced a person to decide whether they would remain broken or begin again. She had chosen the second option. It had not happened overnight. Healing never did. It arrived through ordinary mornings, hard work, long walks, and countless moments nobody else witnessed. The stranger finally reached her side. "I hope I am not too late," he said. His voice was calm and warm. Claire smiled. A real smile this time. "You are right on time." Several guests nearby exchanged curious glances. Jason watched from across the room. For reasons he could not explain. The simple exchange unsettled him far more than any confrontation could have. Because Claire was not behaving like someone who had come to revisit the past. She looked like someone whose future had already arrived. And as the stranger gently offered his arm, Jason realized he was no longer the person commanding the room's attention. The stranger settled beside Claire as naturally as if they had arrived together. Around them, curiosity spread through the ballroom in quiet waves. Guests who had spent the evening discussing engagement plans suddenly found new reasons to pay attention. The man carried himself with effortless confidence, yet there was nothing boastful about him. He did not scan the room looking for recognition. He did not attempt to become the center of attention. If anything, his focus remained entirely on Claire. "How was the drive?" she asked softly. "A little longer than expected," he replied with a smile. The airport was crowded. The simple exchange sounded ordinary, but that was what made it unusual. While everyone else seemed determined to perform for the room, they spoke like two people completely uninterested in impressing anyone. Jason watched from the stage area while another guest approached to congratulate him. He offered a polite response, but his attention never fully left Claire and the stranger. Something about the man's calm demeanor irritated him. Most people entering a room like this would try to establish their importance. This man did not. And somehow that made him seem even more important. Madison noticed Jason staring. "You really do not know him?" she asked again. "No," Jason answered. "Should I?" Madison did not reply immediately. She simply observed the stranger from across the room. "I am not sure," she finally said. Near the windows, Claire and the man continued talking. Their conversation flowed easily, built on familiarity rather than performance. For the first time all evening, Claire looked completely at ease. The tension that had surrounded her arrival seemed gone. A waiter passed carrying a tray of sparkling water and champagne. The stranger thanked him politely before taking a glass for Claire. It was a small gesture, but one that suggested attention rather than obligation. Claire accepted it with a grateful smile. The sight stirred something uncomfortable inside Jason. Years ago, he had known those details. He had known how Claire took her coffee, which songs she replayed during long drives, and how she always reached for sparkling water at formal events. Somewhere along the way, those details had stopped mattering to him. Apparently, they mattered to someone else now. The music shifted as a string quartet began playing near the far side of the ballroom. Golden light reflected from crystal centerpieces, casting shimmering patterns across the ceiling. The evening remained elegant, polished, and controlled. Yet beneath the surface, expectations were beginning to unravel. Several guests quietly approached one another, exchanging theories about the mysterious arrival. A few believed he was an attorney. Others assumed he was a business executive. Nobody seemed certain. And the uncertainty only made people more interested. Then something unexpected happened. An older gentleman near the front of the ballroom suddenly froze while looking toward Claire's companion. His expression changed instantly. Surprise first. Then recognition. He excused himself from his conversation and began crossing the room with purpose. Jason noticed. Madison noticed. So did half the ballroom. The older man stopped directly in front of the stranger and extended his hand. "I cannot believe it is really you," he said with visible respect. "What an honor to see you here tonight." For the first time since arriving, the stranger looked slightly amused. He shook the man's hand warmly. And as dozens of curious eyes turned toward them, Jason felt a growing sense that the evening was no longer unfolding according to his plan. The older gentleman's words seemed to ripple through the ballroom far beyond their volume. Conversations slowed. Heads turned. Curiosity sharpened. The stranger greeted him with genuine warmth, exchanging a few quiet words that nobody else could hear. Yet the reaction alone was enough to change the atmosphere. This was no ordinary guest. That much had become obvious. Claire remained composed beside him, as though none of the attention surprised her. In truth, it did not. She had spent enough time with him to understand something most people never learned. The more accomplished he was, the less interested he became in proving it. Across the room, Jason accepted another handshake from a business associate but barely registered the conversation. His focus remained fixed on Claire and the man standing beside her. One question repeated itself in his mind. Who was he? The answer seemed to matter more with every passing minute. The older gentleman eventually excused himself, though not before expressing his appreciation once again. As he walked away, another guest approached. Then another. Soon a small line had quietly formed around Claire's companion. None of them behaved casually. Each interaction carried a level of respect that was impossible to ignore. Madison folded her arms lightly. "People clearly know him," she said. Jason nodded without responding. What bothered him most was that nobody appeared eager to explain. It was almost as if everyone assumed his identity should already be obvious. Near the windows, the stranger remained patient and gracious. He greeted each person warmly, remembered names, asked about families, and listened more than he spoke. Claire watched him with a faint smile. Years earlier, after her divorce, she had believed success looked like attention. She eventually discovered it looked more like peace. She remembered the afternoon they first met. A rainy Saturday. A small independent bookstore tucked between a coffee shop and a florist. She had been reaching for a novel on the top shelf when another hand reached for the same book. They laughed. Shared a conversation. Then coffee. Nothing dramatic. Nothing cinematic. Just two people enjoying an unexpectedly pleasant afternoon. Looking back, that simplicity had been the beginning of everything. A burst of laughter from the ballroom pulled her back to the present. The engagement celebration continued, but the center of gravity had shifted. Guests who had spent the evening surrounding Jason and Madison now found reasons to wander toward the windows. Even those who pretended not to care kept looking over. Then another unexpected moment arrived. A member of the hotel staff approached the stranger carrying a tablet. "Excuse me, sir," he said politely. "The call from Singapore has been rescheduled. They asked me to let you know immediately." The stranger thanked him and dismissed the matter with a calm nod. Yet the brief exchange had consequences. Jason heard it. So did several executives standing nearby. Singapore. International business. Private scheduling through hotel management. The details were small, but together they painted a larger picture. Jason felt uncertainty tightening inside him. For the first time that night, he stopped wondering whether Claire had moved on. The evidence was standing right in front of him. The real question now was how far she had moved beyond the life he thought he understood. And as another respected guest crossed the ballroom specifically to greet the mysterious man, Jason realized he might not be prepared for the answer. The questions circulating through the ballroom were no longer whispered quietly. They moved from table to table, from group to group, carried beneath polite smiles and carefully controlled curiosity. Nobody wanted to appear overly interested, yet everyone was paying attention. Claire could feel it. So could Jason. The difference was that Claire seemed unaffected by it. She stood beside the man who had arrived unexpectedly, speaking with the same calm ease she had shown all evening. Jason, meanwhile, found himself distracted by every new interaction that unfolded around them. Another executive approached the stranger. Then another. Each greeting carried the same unmistakable tone of respect. Not admiration. Respect. The kind earned over years, not purchased overnight. Madison finally leaned closer. Why does it feel like half the room knows him except us? Jason forced a smile. Because people enjoy creating mystery. But even he did not believe his own explanation. Across the ballroom, the string quartet continued playing softly while guests drifted between conversations. Crystal glasses reflected the warm light overhead. Outside the windows, the city stretched into the distance beneath a sea of white and red headlights. Everything remained beautiful. Yet the emotional center of the evening had shifted completely. Claire noticed Jason watching her again. Their eyes met briefly. Years ago, that look would have carried tension, disappointment, or unresolved hurt. Tonight it carried none of those things. She simply looked at him the way someone looks at a chapter they have already finished reading. The realization unsettled him more than any argument ever could. Then the master of ceremonies returned to the stage. Before we continue with dessert, he announced, we would like to thank several distinguished guests who joined us this evening. Polite applause followed. The host began recognizing local business leaders, community supporters, and corporate sponsors. Most guests listened casually while continuing their conversations. Then the host suddenly paused. He glanced toward the far side of the ballroom and smiled. I was also informed that a very special guest arrived a little while ago. We are honored to welcome him this evening. The room gradually quieted. The host looked directly toward Claire and the man beside her. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Hayes. A ripple moved through the audience. Not a dramatic reaction. Something more powerful. Recognition. Understanding. Several guests immediately exchanged surprised looks. Others straightened in their seats. A few reached for their phones before thinking better of it. Jason felt his heartbeat quicken. Hayes. The name sounded familiar. Very familiar. Somewhere deep in his memory, attached to headlines, acquisitions, interviews, and business reports he had skimmed over countless times. The stranger offered a modest nod toward the stage. Nothing more. No speech. No performance. No attempt to enjoy the attention. Yet somehow his restraint commanded even greater attention. Claire glanced at him and smiled faintly. He returned the smile with quiet affection before turning his focus back to the stage. That simple exchange spoke louder than any introduction could have. Jason stared across the room, trying to place the name. Trying to understand why it suddenly felt important. Then, one of his senior colleagues, standing nearby, whispered something under his breath. Jason heard every word. And as realization finally began forming inside his mind, the confidence he had carried all evening started to disappear. The whisper reached Jason only because the room had become so quiet. That is Alexander Hayes. His colleague did not say the name dramatically. He did not need to. The effect was immediate. Jason knew the name now. Everyone in his industry knew it. Alexander Hayes was the founder of one of the fastest-growing investment groups in the country, a man whose acquisitions regularly made national business headlines. More importantly, he was known for seeing opportunities years before everyone else. Jason felt the confidence he had carried throughout the evening slip another inch. Across the ballroom, Alexander remained completely unaware of the attention surrounding him. Or perhaps he was aware and simply did not care. He listened while an elderly guest spoke about a community project. He asked thoughtful questions. He remembered details. He behaved exactly the same way he had behaved since arriving. The difference was that now everyone understood who they were looking at. Madison stared across the room. "You have got to be kidding me," she whispered. Jason did not answer. He could not stop replaying the image of Claire standing beside Alexander. The realization felt impossible. 3 years ago, he had been certain he understood how Claire's future would unfold without him. He had imagined her remaining somewhere behind, trapped in the shadow of the life they once shared. Yet standing before him was evidence of how wrong he had been. Claire had not remained behind. She had continued moving forward long after he stopped paying attention. The master of ceremonies smiled from the stage. "Mr. Hayes, thank you again for joining us." Polite applause filled the room. Alexander acknowledged it with a simple nod before returning his attention to Claire. Then something happened that nobody expected. One of Jason's senior executives approached Alexander directly. The man was usually confident, even intimidating in business settings. Tonight he looked almost nervous. "Mr. Hayes," he said respectfully, "I wanted to thank you personally for the opportunity." Alexander shook his hand warmly. The opportunity was earned. Several nearby guests exchanged confused looks. Jason frowned. He knew that executive well. Why would a man at that level speak that way? The answer arrived seconds later. "Your expansion project completely changed our division," the executive continued. "We would not be where we are today without Hayes Capital." The words landed like stones dropped into still water. Hayes Capital. Suddenly everything connected. The international calls. The recognition. The respect. The attention from industry leaders. Even Jason's own company had benefited from projects tied to Alexander's investment group. Not directly. Not visibly. But enough to matter. A strange expression crossed Jason's face as another realization followed the first. The most successful person in the ballroom had never stepped onto the stage. He had never asked for a microphone. He had never displayed photographs of achievements on giant screens. He had simply walked in, found Claire, and spent the evening at her side. Claire noticed Jason looking at her again. This time she held his gaze for a moment longer. There was no anger there. No desire for revenge. Only peace. And somehow that hurt far more than resentment ever could. Because Jason finally understood the truth. He had invited Claire to witness his success. Instead, he was witnessing hers. The evening slowly returned to its rhythm, but it no longer felt like the same celebration. The music still played. Crystal glasses still reflected the golden light. Guests still smiled and exchanged polite conversations. Yet beneath the elegance, everyone understood that something important had happened. Not because Alexander Hayes had entered the room. Not because of his success. But because of the woman standing beside him. Claire had arrived carrying none of the symbols people normally use to measure status. She had not made an entrance. She had not sought attention. She had not corrected anyone's assumptions. She had simply shown up as herself. And somehow that had changed. Everything. Near the stage, Jason stood quietly while guests continued offering congratulations. He responded automatically, but his thoughts were elsewhere. Across the ballroom, Claire and Alexander shared a conversation that seemed completely disconnected from the opinions surrounding them. They laughed softly at something only they understood. The sight stirred an unexpected memory inside Jason. Years ago, before promotions, before social status, before endless networking events, he and Claire had laughed that way too. Back when happiness had not required an audience. The realization settled heavily in his chest. Not because he wanted the past back. Because he finally understood what he had lost. Madison noticed the silence beside her. For the first time all evening, neither of them seemed interested in being admired. Sometimes the truth arrived quietly. Sometimes it arrived while watching someone who no longer needed your approval. Near the windows, Alexander glanced at his watch. "We should probably go," he said gently. Claire nodded. The night had served its purpose long before. She picked up her small evening clutch and looked around the ballroom one last time. Not with bitterness. Not with triumph. Simply with gratitude for how far she had come. As they began walking toward the exit, conversations softened once again. Guests watched them cross the room. Some smiled. Others reflected silently. A few seemed inspired. Claire never slowed her pace. She did not stop for a final speech. She did not seek a dramatic moment. Her story no longer required one. When they reached the doors, Jason's voice finally broke the silence. "Claire." She turned. The distance between them was only a few yards, yet it felt much farther than that. Jason searched for the right words. Apologies seemed too late. Explanations seemed unnecessary. Eventually he managed a small smile. "You look happy." Claire studied him for a moment. Then she smiled back. It was kind. Genuine. Free of resentment. "I am." Nothing more needed to be said. Alexander waited patiently beside her. Jason nodded once, accepting the answer. For the first time, he understood that happiness had never been a competition. The doors opened. Cool night air drifted in from the rooftop terrace beyond. Claire slipped her hand into Alexander's, and together they walked toward the city lights waiting outside. Behind them, the ballroom remained bright and crowded. Ahead of them stretched an open skyline filled with possibility. Jason watched until they disappeared from view. Then he looked down at the untouched champagne glass in his hand and finally recognized the lesson the evening had delivered. Claire had not won because she found someone wealthier. She had not won because others admired her. She had won because she rebuilt a life that no longer depended on being chosen. And in the end, she did not win him back. She won herself.